Become a Prime member today by visiting iloveblackpeople.com and receive our free I Love Black People t-shirt, Black Survival Guide, and become a part of our I Love Black People network, which comes with a global safety toolkit, nomad health insurance, Pan-African certification classes, and so much more. Go to iloveblackpeople.com now.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to I Love Black People, where we fearlessly discuss and navigate issues relevant to Black people. I'm your co-host, Sinclair Skinner, co-founder of iloveblackpeople.com. My co-host today is Dr. Tyreen Wright, a scholar, author, and activist. Today, we're discussing independent and sustainable Black communities in the United States during the early 20th century. And so many of us have heard now of the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre and so much behind that. But there were many communities that Black people were able to thrive. And, you know, where would you like to start this conversation, Dr. Wright?
Thank you, Sinclair. I would like to start the conversation. Well, let's start with what we know first, right? And build on that. So everyone knows the Greenwood section of Tulsa, Oklahoma. And that was also known as Black Wall Street. And that was in existence until 1921 when the massacre took place. But the others, one other well-known Black community was destroyed was Rosewood, Florida. Everybody remembers the film Rosewood. And that was an independent Black community. Now, a whole massacre took place as a result of, once again, a white woman accusing a Black man of entering her home and assaulting her. And we know the story with Tulsa, Oklahoma's Greenwood section is similar, right? A Black man bumps into a white woman on the elevator. She says that he groped her and screamed rape, and that led to the massacre and destruction of that city. But the cities that few of us know about, but are very entrenched in, I would add, not just 20th century, but 19th century history, which is the 1800s, is a town called Mound, M-O-U-N-D, Bayou, like Eve's Bayou. And that is in Mississippi. And it was established in 1887 by Isaiah Montgomery and his cousin Benjamin Green. And that was a well-known safe haven that was established in 1887. And this particular town, while it wasn't outright destroyed, there are some interesting things that happened there in terms of the politics. Isaiah Montgomery felt that because they were living in this period that was approaching the nadir, so 1895 to 1915 is known as the nadir or nadir in U.S. history. It's our lowest point in terms of the levels of violence that African Americans endured post-Reconstruction. And so Isaiah Montgomery felt a need to protect this viable land-owning Black community. And yes, people saw the members of Mound Bayou as very different than other Black people because this was a land-owning community, sustainable community. And so they had garnered a great deal of support. The only issue with Mound Bayou, though, at a certain point is that once radical Reconstruction is over, Isaiah Montgomery sort of cuts a deal and goes to a local political meeting and affirms for local white politicians that the Black residents of Mound Bayou would not advocate or push for suffrage, which they had already earned legally under the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. But he assures them in exchange for the fact that they could be safe. So he almost basically traded away the future freedoms of the Black residents of Mound Bayou, and Jim Crow as a institution, as a system in the United States would be right around the corner, and it sort of affirmed what Isaiah Montgomery did. But what he really, just so people understand, what he was trying to do was
contextually, when was this? When was this? When was this?
Well, the date that he does that, I don't know the exact date.
I'm talking the year. I'm talking the time.
The period is post radical Reconstruction. So once Reconstruction is ended, which is in 1877, right? And what this town was founded in 1887, around 10 years after that, and this is approaching that 1895-1915 period that is called the Nadir, which is very violent. This is Mississippi, Mound Bayou.
Okay.
Yes, Mound Bayou. And the founders of the city were Isaiah Montgomery and his cousin, Benjamin Green. But it was an exceptional community. Also, a lot of people overlook this because people don't really see northern states as having these independent, sustainable Black communities. But Seneca Village was a well-known Black community that was in what is present-day Central Park. And the community was a land-owning African-American community with several plots, and some of the plots were obtained by...
What state was that?
This is New York. Seneca Village is in New York, and it's specifically in New York City, present day Central Park. I'm sorry, so that's a little local, that's a little regional bias, right? If I say New York, I think you're supposed to know New York City. But the point is that present day Central Park, which is a major park and public space in New York City, had a all African American community called Seneca Village. And it was there that African Methodist Episcopal members of the church, so African American members of the AME church, obtained plots of land in what is present day Central Park. So this community existed for about 32 years, but it's through, and now this one doesn't end violently, but it was through New York State legislation, which used eminent domain to seize the land from this community. And this is really how much of the African population in New York ends up being in the lower, in the swamps of lower Manhattan, pushed up to Seneca Village, and then eventually pushed up to Harlem. It's a gradual forced migration of the people up the island of Manhattan, so they existed from 1825 to 1857. Any questions about that one? No.
Well, I think you took us back quite far, and I think that's a good context.
Was 19th century.
Okay, so where would you say some of these other communities, or would you say those were the two major ones?
Well, no, there's plenty others. So then there's also, or just a few others, but there's also in New York, Weeksville, also known as present day, it's known as Bedford Stuyvesant. And it was actually founded in 1838 by James Weeks. And people should understand, 1838, the Civil War hasn't taken place. Sure, some states in the North, particularly New York, they engaged in a gradual emancipation, which began in 1799 and was completed by 1827. But this is around 10, 11 years out of enslavement in New York State and New York City. And so there is a sustainable Black community, and it's at least 800 people in this community. They have schools, they have homes, they have churches. And today, Weeksville is an actual historic site in Brooklyn. and you can go and visit the historic site and the homes that are preserved in that area. But it also was a safe haven for people who were coming from the South and running to freedom, to escape enslavement. So it also was a stronghold of the Underground Railroad. And so there are many historic homes in that area of Brooklyn, current day, well, Bedford Stuyvesant, but the smaller community known as Weeksville. And it was founded by James Weeks, right? So hence the name.
So why would you say Tulsa, Oklahoma is the place that so many people talk about? Are there other communities that had reached the levels of success of a Tulsa, or what would be some of the reasons why that has remained so much in, even if it's in the past, it's still something that has shown up as a part of that history of Black people in America?
Well, I think Black Wall Street is the reason right there, because the Greenwood section of Tulsa, Oklahoma is classically referred to as Black Wall Street. And we know that this was a really affluent Black community. And it made sense. If you understood how enslavement worked, you know that slavery was the labor force in every industry that existed, which means that coming out of enslavement, the African person who survived enslavement was a master of many industries. They had all the skill sets. Therefore, when not you working for someone else, they could put all of these skills to their own use and benefit. So this is part of what makes sense. They could also build buildings. They could also engage in skills and skilled labor, iron, so welders, all kinds of skilled professions. And I think that the problem with Tulsa, Oklahoma was that a better way to describe it than a city is that it was a section of Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? So it is a section of the larger city that is called Greenwood. So it wasn't like they were tucked away from the whites in the city. Other white people could observe the affluence and the progressiveness and the structures being erected in this Black section of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and it became envied. They coveted it. So I think that's part of the reason why, it's so famous or infamous, because of the fact that it wasn't hidden. Some of these other places are a little hidden, like Mound Bayou, right? They are less obvious to the neighboring white inhabitants unless they're looking for it. But Tulsa, Oklahoma's Greenwood section is in an urban space. It's in the city. It's visible. It's accessible. But also, can I give you a couple more? So there was also the Brentwood section, Brentwood, Maryland. And the Brentwood section of Maryland, it's also been referred to as Black Brentwood. And it was incorporated in
when was this?
1924. So it's a 20th century phenomenon. And it was founded by a Reconstruction era veteran. And the veteran was actually a part of the U.S. colored troops. So the community settled Black families seeking to own their own homes and build their own homes after the war. And so that's how the Brentwood section is initiated in Maryland. But also, I wanted to highlight another one because I always leave this out. Tuskegee, right? We know Tuskegee is a university or institute, but the institute predates the university in the sense that the community, let me say it that way, not the institute, the community, the Tuskegee community, which would have been very progressive during the Reconstruction period. That's part of how Tuskegee gets its start, coming out of Reconstruction, and how progressive it was during Reconstruction. And so, the story, but Tuskegee was a sustainable industrial Black community that essentially masqueraded, so to speak, as a school. So, and this is one of the few institutions or few towns or communities where we know for sure that there were 40 plus industries. And the philosophy of that community was to produce what one consumed. So,
Why would you say it was masquerading as a school? Why would you? What was the
because most
significance of?
people, well, because most people, so there's two sides to the Tuskegee story in the sense that most people are coming to Tuskegee for education. But the reality is that all of the students at some point or another would be part of the Tuskegee labor force. And that is something that allows them to have all of these industries, 40 plus industries. So all of the students were engaged in some form of skill or industry right there. Why? Because many students who came to Tuskegee did not pay tuition in its early founding years. So the first year they would go to school part-time and work for the school full-time. And then the remaining 4 years, they would go to school full-time and work for the institution part-time. And where would they
But
work? They would work in all of these industries.
And is that what you're saying? So it was a very sustained. It was
Yes.
self-contained, a self-sustainable
Yes.
community. In
Yes.
what ways?
Well, the labor force, first of all, with the labor force that is overwhelmingly the students, right? They have a steady flow of labor that can weather economic hardships. So they don't really have to worry about whether or not the institution can keep running in terms of the functional sense because they have the
I know, but
labor
what
there.
did they? Right, you said the labor part was, but like, what did they produce with the labor? Like,
Oh,
can you give an
everything.
example?
So shoes, mattresses, wagons. Of course, there was the Department of Agriculture at the school, and from 1895 on, George Washington Carver is there. So there is food production right there. There is cultivation. So there is breeding and cultivation of small and large animals meant to maintain the agricultural aspects of the school. There's will writing, there's dressmaking, you name it. I mean, that's where that whole concept comes from. Leave your underwear at home. We make our own at Tuskegee. Because the idea is that
Wow.
all
Okay.
the human necessities for man, woman, and child were produced right there on site. And so literally, if you were in sole shoemaking, you couldn't just make the sole of a shoe. You had to know how to make the whole shoe. If you were in mattress making, you couldn't just know how to make sew the seams of the mattress. You had to know how to make the whole mattress. There was a programmatic aversion to partially completed goods. So if you were in wheelwright, you
From the
had to know
bricks,
how to make
look,
a
even the
right,
bricks, though, right? Yeah, even
right.
the bricks
So
were made. So even construction. So what would you
right.
then say from building there, but the actual destruction of Tulsa and the destruction of some of these communities? What would you say were some of the real issues that we should be able to take from that to do better in building community now and deal with some of the issues that are consistently facing us and undermining our communities today? What would you see as some of the lessons that we should learn?
Well, some of the lessons and the biggest chief lesson and commentary on all of this revisiting independent and sustainable Black communities is the fact that we shouldn't think that we haven't already done it. We already did it and did it very well. Most of these communities emerged the first 50 years after enslavement within that period. So you're talking about 250 years of chattel slavery, 50 years of freedom, and people are already running, building, sustaining, and advancing their own independent communities. It scared the hell out of white America. And this is part of the reason why most of them were destroyed very effectively. Now, that being said, when we talk about our current condition and problems and issues, political, social, and otherwise, we always make it seem like we need to reinvent the wheel, like we must have not figured something out about this American paradigm, or we're not problem solving adequately enough to solve our the issues of our present condition. And that's not true. What actually happened in the United States in terms of the larger historical picture is that the African population that survived slavery figured it out too quickly, to the point where they got political power also as a result of radical Reconstruction, and also set up their own communities across, the South. And that was a little bit too much, too fast. And this is even stated by American politicians that it was a lot. They were supporting of the formerly enslaved until they realized that the formerly enslaved could be their new competitors. And so all of these communities were destroyed. My answer to your question is just that we just, it's like a Sankofa answer. Go back and fetch it. Go back and look at our history. There's almost no problem in our situation that we didn't solve. The reality is that we live in a nation that has a very anti-human culture and destructive nature. And so when we have erected and created solutions to our problems, those very communities that produce those solutions were destroyed. It's just really that simple. So, that's my answer.
So, I think your point you're making is very sound. As far as we move forward, though, and we're here and in the United States, and people are looking at their own communities and trying to figure out, where do we go from here, and how do we get there? The fact that we've done this before, I think, is comforting, if not informative. But what would you say would be some of the steps that we should take, or maybe some of the steps that we might have mistaken as it relates to moving forward?
Well, I think that some of the steps, I have to really honestly, so let me just say it another way. I really honestly think that we are living in the backlash of very quick progress, right? After enslavement. So from 1865 until around the turn of the century, early 1900s. And so the reality is that people have to make a decision. If you want the sustainable and independent Black communities, you do have to change how you view the necessity of integration also. Part of maintaining these communities, because if you look at the example of Mount Bayou was exclusive, and it was certainly a community that was segregated, separated, and they wanted to be. Why? Because they did not trust the social, political, or not even the political. They did not trust the social environment. They did not trust that American whites could not be openly violent towards them. And so for the most part, they choose to self-segregate. I think for the most part, what we see today is Black people have integrated into the structures that exist in America in every way, except for in residential communities. Most residential communities across the nation are segregated, meaning that most Black people live close and in proximity to other Black people. Most white people live in close proximity to other white people. For people to erect such communities like this, one would probably have to establish some serious access to land, which is something that we know Black people in this country have been marginalized, right? So it's very hard to acquire land, and it's become even harder. So at different points in our history, we've probably had more land ownership than we do now, because that is one of the ways that marginalization, discrimination has played out in America, right? If you have land, it is the basis of freedom. You can produce food, you can erect buildings, you can sustain yourself. So keeping Black people, African Americans, land less is a way of also making them powerless or making us powerless. So that's the beginning. If we can roll back the clock on some of the actual legislation that redlined Black people, that kept land out of Black people's hands, that stopped land from being passed on. I'll give you a perfect example. And this is something that I'm currently researching, and I don't have all the answers, but I know for a fact in a place like New York City, after 1827, when enslavement was ended, after a gradual emancipation from slavery took place over a number of years, 28 years, a law went on the books in New York City that forbade father to pass land on to son, mother to pass land to daughter. Every generation, forcing every generation out of enslavement to wipe the slate clean and start anew, and making it impossible for there to be an accumulation of wealth. So that is one. Now, I'm not sure how that got overturned or how that was dissolved, meaning how that clause, how that legislation that did that was stopped, was discontinued, because we know that there are some small pockets like Weeksville, like Seneca Village, even though Seneca Village is taken under eminent domain, they are able to actually end those kind of practices. However, that was initiated in a place like, and I don't want to say like a place like New York. New York, it wasn't that progressive. But point is that was one of the things that existed post-slavery to keep from having an accumulation of wealth via land ownership. So what can we do today? We have to attack this issue of land ownership in order to revisit the sustainable Black community, because that'll allow for us to talk about the production of food, transferring wealth through land, erecting homes and buildings. And then, of course, that grandfathers you in a way to having some political objectives in the areas that you're in.
Well, I think that, again, bringing it home to that as we close out is probably the most powerful thing we can do is to continue to build off what our ancestors have done in real time under some really difficult circumstances. And I just want to thank you, Dr. Wright, as you always do, to shed light on where we've been so that we can better understand where we need to go. And we're just so thankful for you. And I want to thank you all for listening to I Love Black People. I'm your co-host, Sinclair Skinner. I am because we are.